The letter fell from Caroline Hadley's trembling fingers and drifted to the dusty floorboards of the Millhaven post office like a dying bird, and the sound it made when it landed was nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the sound her heart made when she finally understood what she was reading. She had written to a stranger for 8 months. 8 months of pouring her soul onto paper, of confessing fears she had never spoken aloud, of laughing through written words at things that had not made her laugh in years. 8 months of falling, slowly and then all at once, completely and irreversibly in love with a man she had never seen, a man who called himself simply I.W. In the return correspondence, a man whose handwriting she could identify from across a room, whose phrasing she had memorized the way other women memorized hymns. And now she stood in the Millhaven post office with that final letter in her hands, the letter in which I.W. had finally, breathlessly, revealed himself, and the world had collapsed inward like a burning building. Because I.W. was Isaiah Warren. Isaiah Warren, whose fence line ran parallel to her own. Isaiah Warren, who tipped his hat to her every morning when she brought water to her garden. Isaiah Warren, who had helped her repair her roof after the August storm and never once asked for payment. Isaiah Warren, who had argued with her at the town council meeting about water rights with such infuriating calm that she had gone home and written a letter to her stranger that very same night, fuming and somehow, inexplicably, laughing. She had written to her neighbor. She had fallen in love with her neighbor, and he had known. He had known for how long? Had he known from the beginning? Had he been sitting on his porch every evening, reading her most private confessions, knowing exactly who had written them? The betrayal hit her like a physical force, hot and sudden and blinding, and when the door to the post office swung open and Isaiah Warren himself stepped through it, tall and sun-bronzed with his dark hat in his hands and his gray eyes finding her immediately across the room, she understood that this confrontation had been coming for a long time and neither of them was ready for it. "Caroline," he said, just her name, just that. "How long," she whispered, "how long did you know it was me?" And in the space of that question, in the silence that stretched between them, every letter, every confession, every desperate and beautiful word she had ever written to her stranger rose up and hung in the air between them like smoke. And the story of how they had arrived at this impossible moment began to unspool from the very beginning. It had started, as most unlikely things in 1878 do, with a notice in the Millhaven Gazette. The Millhaven Gazette was published every Thursday by a man named Walter Prout, who had 3 teeth and strong opinions about territorial taxation, and it served the entire county of Calhoun in the New Mexico Territory, reaching ranches and homesteads and the occasional cavalry outpost by way of riders who were paid in bread and coin. On the 14th of February, 1878, Walter Prout had included, tucked between an advertisement for Dobbin's medicated horse liniment and a notice about a missing mule, a small personal notice that read as follows: "Correspondence invited. Any person of good character seeking intellectual companionship and honest exchange of letters, write to Box 14, Millhaven Post Office. All replies answered. Discretion assured." Caroline Hadley had read that notice 6 times before she put the paper down. She was 26 years old and had been living alone on the 40-acre homestead her father had left her for 2 years since his death. Her father, Edmund Hadley, had been a schoolteacher who had come west from Virginia with a trunk full of books and the unshakable conviction that education could civilize any wilderness. He had taught Caroline to read Latin and to argue philosophy, and to love literature with the kind of devotion most people reserved for religion. He had also, inadvertently, made her almost completely unsuitable for the social life of Millhaven, New Mexico Territory, because the men in Millhaven wanted wives who could butcher hogs and make soap and smile pleasantly at things that were not interesting, and Caroline could not seem to stop herself from having opinions. She was not unhappy. She wanted to be clear about that, even in the privacy of her own mind. She had her books, she had her garden, she had her 2 horses and her small herd of goats, and she had the friendship of me Sutton at the dry goods store and Reverend Alcott's wife Dorothy, who played the piano beautifully, and did not mind when Caroline spent Sunday afternoons reading at her kitchen table. She was not unhappy, but she was lonely in the specific way that intelligent people become lonely when there is no one around them who wants to talk about the things that matter most. And so, with the kind of reckless courage that 8 months later she would still not entirely understand in herself, Caroline Hadley sat down at her writing desk on the 15th of February, 1878, and wrote her first letter to Box 14. She introduced herself simply as C.H. She said she was a woman of 26 living on a homestead in the New Mexico Territory. She said she loved books and found conversation about ideas more nourishing than conversation about weather. She said she was not looking for romance or marriage or anything of that kind, but simply for someone to talk to on paper, someone who might understand what it felt like to live in a place that was vast and beautiful and occasionally very, very quiet. She sealed the letter, walked it to the Millhaven post office, handed it to the postmaster Gus Flannery with her chin up and her expression daring him to say something, and went home. She spent the next 12 days convincing herself she had made a terrible mistake. The reply came on the 27th of February, and it was 3 pages long. The man who called himself I.W. wrote with the kind of directness that Caroline had always found bracing and rare. He did not waste sentences on pleasantries. He said he had posted the notice because he had recently finished reading Middlemarch and had no one to discuss it with, a circumstance he found genuinely insulting to both himself and the book. He said he was a man of 29 working land in the New Mexico Territory. He said he agreed completely that conversation about weather was a form of intellectual surrender. He said he had a horse named General who was both magnificent and infuriating in equal measure, and that this was the most honest relationship in his life, which was either a testament to the horse or an indictment of his social circumstances. He was not sure which. Caroline read the letter twice and then laughed out loud in her empty kitchen, the sound startling the cat off the windowsill. She wrote back the same evening, and so it began. What grew between them in those first weeks was nothing like Caroline had expected, because she had expected nothing, really, or perhaps something stiff and literary, an exchange of book recommendations conducted at a polite distance. Instead, she found herself, letter by letter, being drawn into the most honest conversation she had ever had in her life. I.W. was funny, not in the performed way of men who wanted to be admired for their wit, but in the quiet, unexpected way of someone who saw the absurdity in things and could not resist pointing at it. He was also serious, deeply serious, about the things he cared about. He wrote about the land the way Caroline's father had written about books, as though it were alive and required tending and deserved respect. He wrote about his work with a kind of focused intensity that she recognized, because she felt it herself when she was doing something that mattered. He also, gradually, began to reveal things about himself that she suspected he had not intended to reveal. In one letter he mentioned almost in passing that his father had left the family when I.W. was 12, and then spent 3 sentences firmly moving on to the topic of water rights, as though he had said nothing significant at all. Caroline had stared at those sentences for a long time before writing back, and when she responded she did not press him on it, but she acknowledged it gently, the way she would have wanted someone to acknowledge something that she had accidentally made too visible. He noticed. She could tell from the next letter that he noticed, and something in the texture of his writing shifted after that, became slightly less armored, slightly more present. By April they were writing twice a week. By May, Caroline had admitted to him, in carefully chosen words, that she had been engaged once, 3 years ago, to a man named Thomas Birch who had ultimately decided that a woman who argued with him was not the kind of woman he wanted to spend his life with. She had written about it with dry humor on the surface and genuine pain underneath, and I.W. had written back something that she read so many times the paper became soft at the folds. said, "A man who cannot live with your mind is not a man worth living with. That is not a reflection on your worth. It is a reflection on his capacity, which appears to have been limited. General, the horse has more sense, and he once tried to eat a fence post." She had pressed that letter to her chest and stood in her kitchen feeling something she could not immediately name. She realized some weeks later, falling in love. This was inconvenient, alarming, and completely impossible to stop. She tried reason. She reminded herself that she did not know what this man looked like, did not know his real name, had never heard his voice. She told herself that what she felt was simply the intoxication of being understood, which was a different thing from love and should not be mistaken for it. She wrote less frequently for 2 weeks in June, keeping the letters brief and somewhat formal, and then came a letter from IW that said, simply and without any apparent embarrassment, "I find that when your letters come less often, the days are considerably less interesting. I am not sure what to do with that observation except to share it with you. I thought you should know." She had written back 3 pages that same night. Meanwhile, in the physical world of Millhaven, New Mexico Territory, Caroline Hadley continued to live her life in the visible, daily, dust and sunlight way of a woman running a homestead alone. She rose at 5 o'clock each morning, built the fire, put the coffee on, and went out to tend to the animals before the heat of the day became serious. She kept a kitchen garden that produced tomatoes and beans and more squash than she could eat alone, and she traded the excess at Mee Sutton's dry goods store for flour and salt and the occasional luxury of canned peaches. On Sundays, she attended services at Millhaven's small white church, and afterward took her dinner with the Alcotts, who were kind people, and asked nothing too demanding of her. On the occasional Saturday, she drove her wagon into town for supplies and news, stopping at the post office to check Box 14 with a quickening in her chest that she found both delightful and somewhat embarrassing. And every day, without particular significance or ceremony, she saw Isaiah Warren. Isaiah Warren's property ran along the eastern edge of Caroline's land, separated by a fence line of cedar posts and 3 strands of wire that both of them maintained with scrupulous fairness, each taking responsibility for their own side. He was a quiet man by reputation in Millhaven, known for doing good work and keeping his own counsel. He had come to the territory 6 years ago from somewhere in Texas, bought the land from a family named Grissom, who had given up on it after 2 dry summers, and had turned it into one of the more productive small cattle operations in the county through what appeared to be sheer patient stubbornness. He was, Caroline had always thought, a perfectly unremarkable neighbor in the best possible sense. He did not bother her. He helped when help was wanted and left her alone when it was not. He was polite without being intrusive, competent without being showy, and possessed of a quality of stillness that she had always found restful in a landscape that was frequently loud with weather and other people's noise. She had never thought of him romantically. She wanted to be clear about that too. She had categorized him, in the filing system of her mind, under reliable neighboring presence, and closed the drawer. The town council meeting about water rights happened in early June of 1878. There had been a dry spring, drier than usual even by New Mexico standards, and the question of how the water from Calhoun Creek was to be divided among the properties that depended on it had become, over the course of several weeks, genuinely contentious. Several of the larger cattle operations, owned by men named Holloway and Pierce, were arguing for a division system that would give priority to operations with more than 50 head, which would effectively leave small homesteaders like Caroline with a diminished share during the dry months. Caroline had come to that meeting prepared. She had read the relevant territorial water statutes, she had made notes, and she had dressed with deliberate care in her good blue dress, which she knew was a small act of armor. She sat in the second row of chairs in the Millhaven Town Hall and waited for the right moment. The right moment came when Holloway, A large man with a red face and the slow, confident manner of someone who expected to be agreed with, finished his presentation of the priority system and looked around the room with a satisfied expression. Caroline stood up. She made her argument clearly, citing the statute, pointing out that priority based on herd size had no basis in territorial law and would in fact constitute an illegal diversion that smaller landowners would have standing to challenge in the territorial court in Santa Fe, which she understood could be an expensive and inconvenient process for everyone involved. There was a silence, and then from the back of the room a voice said, "She's right." Caroline turned. Isaiah Warren was sitting in the last row with his arms folded and an expression of calm certainty that somehow, inexplicably, made her want to argue with him. "The statute is clear," he said. He was not speaking loudly, but the room was quiet enough that everyone heard him perfectly. Prior appropriation. First in time, first in right. Miss Hadley's family has held water rights on her land since 1863. Holloway's operation was established in 1871. The size of the herd is legally irrelevant. Holloway turned red. Pierce said something under his breath. Several people began talking at once. Caroline looked at Isaiah Warren for a moment, caught in the strange and unpleasant sensation of having someone agree with her so completely and so calmly that there was nothing left to argue about. "Thank you," she said, which was not what she had planned to say. He nodded once, the small, precise nod of someone acknowledging a fact. That evening, sitting at her writing desk with the windows open to catch the evening breeze, Caroline wrote to her stranger about the meeting. She did not mention Isaiah Warren by name. She said that she had made her argument and that an unexpected ally had appeared from the back of the room like something out of a dime novel, and that she was not sure whether to be grateful or annoyed that she had not been left to win the argument entirely on her own. She described his quality of stillness, the way he had stated the fact as though it were simply a thing that existed and required only to be named. She wrote, "I think what bothers me about people like that is that they are so certain. Not arrogantly certain, which would be easier to dismiss, but quietly certain, the way a compass needle is certain. It is both admirable and somehow infuriating." IW's reply, which came 4 days later, said, "I think what you are describing is the particular frustration of meeting someone who operates from a position of genuine conviction rather than performed confidence. These are very different things. Performed confidence is brittle and breaks under pressure. Genuine conviction is annoying because it does not require your approval to exist. I suspect your neighbor is more interesting than you have given him credit for." Caroline had read that letter and felt, for reasons she could not quite explain, vaguely unsettled. The summer deepened. July came in like a forge, hot and white and relentless, and the work of keeping the homestead going through the heat was serious and constant. The goats needed more water. The garden needed shade. One of her horses, a bay mare named Josephine, developed a swollen leg that kept Caroline up for 3 consecutive nights in anxious rotation. On the third night at roughly 2 in the morning, when Caroline was sitting in the barn with a lantern and a wet cloth and the dim determined hope that this was going to be all right, she heard a knock on the barn door, and then the door opened, and Isaiah Warren stood there in the lamplight with his hat off and a look of practical concern on his face. "Saw your light," he said. "Is it the bay?" She stared at him. "How did you know about Josephine?" "Miss Sutton mentioned it at the store." He stepped into the barn, crouched down, and examined the swollen leg with careful hands. "Have you been keeping it wrapped?" "Yes." "Cold compresses?" "Yes." He straightened up. "She's going to be fine. It's a strain, not a break. Keep doing what you're doing." He looked at her directly then, and in the lantern light his eyes were the particular shade of gray that reminded her of weather coming in from the mountains. And she noticed, in the involuntary cataloging way of someone who has been awake for 3 days, that he was not what she had always generically labeled as unremarkable. He was quite the opposite, actually. But this was 3 in the morning and she was exhausted, and she dismissed the observation. "Thank you," she said. "Do you want company for a while? I don't sleep much in the heat." She hesitated for one moment and then said yes. They sat in the barn for 2 hours, Caroline on a bale of hay and Isaiah on an overturned bucket, and they talked. Not about anything remarkable, about the water levels in the creek and the quality of that summer's hay, and whether Walter Prout had any idea what he was doing with the Gazette's coverage of the territorial legislature. It was comfortable in the way that a conversation is comfortable when both people in it are genuinely at ease, not performing ease but actually possessing it. And when dawn began to lighten the edges of the sky and Isaiah stood up and said he had stocked to check and thanked her for the company, Caroline sat for a long time afterward in the quiet barn with Josephine breathing steadily beside her and thought, "He is interesting." She did not write to her stranger about this incident. She was not sure why. It sat in her, unwritten, and took up space. The August storm was the worst in 7 years. It came out of the west on a Tuesday evening with 20 minutes of warning, a flat black wall of cloud that turned the sky the color of a bruise, and then opened up in a way that felt less like rain and more like the sky simply falling. Caroline got the animals inside and herself inside, and spent 2 hours listening to the sound of the territory rearranging itself outside her walls. When it stopped, she went out and found that a section of her roof had given way over the back room, letting in sky and rain, and a branch from the cottonwood tree that now lay across her father's writing desk. She stood in the wreckage of the back room with her lamp and her heart somewhere in her stomach and did not allow herself to cry, because crying was not going to fix the roof. Isaiah Warren appeared at 8 in the morning with tools in his ranch hand, a young man named Elias who was 17, and moved with the cheerful efficiency of someone who had not yet discovered that things could go permanently wrong. Together, without being asked, without making a ceremony of it, they repaired the roof. It took 2 days. Caroline fed them both, working around the mess, and the inconvenience with a focused practicality that she suspected was how she handled all forms of emotional difficulty. On the second evening, when Elias had gone home and Isaiah was gathering his tools in the blue post-storm light, Caroline came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one. He took it and stood beside her, and they looked out at the land, which was washed clean and impossibly green in the way of the desert after a significant rain, and for a while neither of them said anything. Then Caroline said, "I don't know how to repay this." And Isaiah said without any particular weight, "You could invite me to dinner sometime." She looked at him. He was looking out at the land, not at her, his profile clean against the evening sky. "All right," she said. "Saturday." He came to dinner on Saturday, and then the following Saturday, and then the one after that, until Saturday dinners became a fixture of that autumn in a way that felt entirely natural and not at all like something that needed to be examined. They talked. That was what she would have said to anyone who asked, which no one did because no one knew, which was somehow both a relief and a private source of melancholy she could not fully explain. They talked about everything. About the land and the weather and the news from Santa Fe and Washington, and the wider world that arrived in Millhaven slowly, and often misshapen by the distance it had traveled. About books, because it turned out that Isaiah had read more than she would have guessed, not the same books as Caroline, but books that intersected with hers in interesting ways, and their arguments about ideas were the best arguments Caroline had ever had because Isaiah never argued to win, only to understand. She did not know what to do with any of this. She put it in a separate drawer of her mind and told herself it was simply neighborliness. Meanwhile, the letters continued. By September, she and IW were writing to each other 3 times a week, sometimes 4. The letters had grown longer and more complex, layered with references to earlier letters, with ongoing conversations that stretched across months, with the kind of intimacy that is only possible when 2 people have been deeply honest with each other over time. She had told him things she had never told anyone. About her mother, who had died when Caroline was 9, of a fever that the local doctor in Virginia had not been able to treat. about the particular grief of growing up in a house with a father who loved her fiercely and was present in every intellectual way, and sometimes seemed to find the emotional dimensions of parenthood somewhat baffling. About the year after her father's death, when she had sat on this land and genuinely could not imagine what she was doing here and why she should continue. He had told her things too, about his mother, who was still living in Texas, and who he wrote to religiously every Sunday, even though her replies were infrequent and brief. About the brother he had lost to cholera in 1872, whose name was Daniel and who had been, in his words, the better one of us, which is the particular cruelty of that kind of loss. About the reason he had come to New Mexico, which involved a difficult business situation in Texas that he described in careful, restrained language that told Caroline it had been more painful than he was willing to fully show. She had not pressed him. She acknowledged it and moved on, the way he had done for her. He noticed. She could tell. In October, IW's letter had said something that changed the temperature of everything. He had written, "I find that I think about you with a regularity that has become impossible to categorize as simple intellectual interest. I am aware that I am a man who has expressed a thing on paper that I have not expressed aloud, which is either cowardice or caution, and I am not certain which. I am not certain what to do about what I have told you, and I would not blame you for finding the uncertainty inconvenient, but I thought you should know." Caroline had sat with that letter for 3 days before she responded, and then she had written back, "I think about you too," with the same regularity and the same inability to categorize it as something other than what it is. "I am not frightened by this, which perhaps I should be, given that I have never seen your face. But the truth is that I have seen something more essential than your face, and I am not certain that the rest matters as much as I once would have thought." They had not written about the possibility of meeting. That was the secret they were both keeping from each other, the question neither of them would name. She felt it in every letter after that, the thing unsaid, the presence behind the words. And then, in the first week of November, IW had sent a letter that was different from all the others. It was short. Just a single page, it said. "I have wanted to tell you something for some time, and I have been, it turns out, a coward about it, which is not a quality I would have attributed to myself before these letters made me honest. I am going to tell you now because I think continuing without telling you would be a kind of deception that I am no longer willing to participate in, even in service of something I value as much as I value this. I know who you are. I have known for several months. I am your neighbor. My name is Isaiah Warren. I am writing to tell you this before we meet, because the alternative would be letting you discover it by accident, and the thought of you discovering it by accident and believing it was a trap, or a game, or a dark and hidden motive of some kind, is the thing I cannot bear. I want you to know it from me, in my own words, in my own hand. Whatever you do with this information is entirely your right. If you never want to speak to me again, I will respect that with everything I have. But I want you to know that not a word I have written to you was anything other than the truth." The letter had arrived on a Thursday morning, which was when Caroline went to town to collect mail. She had read it in the post office, standing at the counter with Gus Flannery pretending not to watch her from behind his sorting boxes. The letter had fallen from her fingers, and then the door had opened and Isaiah Warren had walked in, and they arrived at the moment with which this story began. "How long?" she had whispered. "How long did you know it was me?" He stood in the doorway of the post office with his hat in his hands and his gray eyes steady on her face, and she watched him decide not to flinch from it. "March," he said, "the letter about your father's writing desk. You mentioned the cottonwood tree outside the window. There is only one cottonwood like that in the county." I understood then, and I considered stopping. I want you to know that. I considered stopping immediately, and I didn't, and I have thought every day since about whether that was wrong of me. "It was wrong of you," she said. "I know. You sat at my dinner table every Saturday and you knew. I know. You knew what I had told you and you sat there and you said nothing. I know that too. She picked the letter up from the floor with hands that were not entirely steady. Outside on Millhaven's Main Street, a wagon was passing and someone called out a greeting to someone else, and the ordinary world continued in its ordinary way, entirely indifferent to the fact that something in Caroline Hadley's life had just broken open. "I need to think," she said. "Yes. I need you to leave now." He put his hat on. He looked at her for one more moment, and in his expression was everything he had written in every letter, all of it visible now, all of it real and present in his actual face, which she had been looking at for years without seeing because she had not had the right context to see it. Then he turned and walked out of the post office, and the door fell closed behind him, and Gus Flannery found something very urgent to do with the mail and pretended he had not witnessed any of it. Caroline walked home. She did not drive the wagon. She left the wagon at the livery and walked, which was 3 miles, because she needed the space of 3 miles and the rhythm of walking to do anything with what she was carrying. The betrayal was real. She needed to allow herself to feel that without immediately managing it, without immediately finding the reasonable interpretation that made it smaller or more forgivable. He had known. He had sat across her dinner table knowing exactly what she had trusted him with in those letters, and he had said nothing. Every conversation they had had since March had been conducted on unequal terms, with him holding knowledge she did not have, which was the definition of a hidden advantage, a dark advantage, even if his intentions had not been dark. But the word arrived in her mind with the insistence of something she could not ignore. But he had told her. He had told her himself in writing before the accident of circumstance could tell her for him. He had named what he had done, called it deception, accepted her right to be angry. He had not minimized it. He had not offered excuses. He had said, "I know," and he had said it 3 times, once for each of the specific things she threw at him, and he had not flinched from a single one. She walked 3 miles through the November afternoon with the high desert light going golden and cold around her, and thought about 8 months of letters and what was true in them, and what it meant that all of it was still true. She did not resolve anything that day. She sat with her fire that evening and her cat in her lap and her father's books on the shelf around her, and felt the specific loneliness of a person who has been understood and who has, now, the terrible task of deciding what to do about it. She did not write a letter. For the first time in 8 months she had nothing to write. She did not sleep well. For 4 days, Caroline did not go outside except for the absolute necessity of tending to the animals. She saw Isaiah's property across the fence line and looked away. She was aware that she was doing something adolescent and possibly unkind, but she was also aware that she was not ready, and that not being ready was a legitimate thing. On the 5th day, Miss Sutton appeared at her door with a pie. Miss Sutton was 43 years old and had been married for 20 years to a man who had died of a heart attack while loading flour sacks, and she had run the dry goods store alone, since then, with a competence and a warmth that Caroline had always found both impressive and deeply comforting. She was the kind of woman who made pie the way other people made arguments, as a direct and nourishing form of statement. "I'm not going to ask," Miss said, setting the pie on the kitchen table, "what happened between you and Isaiah Warren, but I am going to tell you something and I want you to hear it." Caroline sat down. "All right." "Isaiah Warren," Miss said, "has been the same person every day since he arrived in this county. I have watched men who are one thing in public and another in private, and I have watched men who are so afraid of being known that they construct elaborate versions of themselves and live inside them. Isaiah is not any of those things. He makes mistakes. He is not perfect, but he is honest about who he is, and in my experience that is rarer than gold in the ground." She paused. "I don't know what he did, but I know what he is." Caroline looked at the pie. "He deceived me," she said. "Then decide what that is worth to you," Miss said simply. After me left, Caroline sat at her writing desk for a long time without writing anything. Then she pulled out a piece of paper and picked up her pen. She wrote, "Isaiah." She stared at his name in her handwriting for a while. His real name, not a set of initials, his actual name written by her actual hand. She wrote, "I am not finished being angry. I want you to know that. I'm also not finished thinking, which means the situation has not resolved itself yet. I thought you should know both of those things. CH." She folded it, walked to the fence line between their properties, and attached it to the third fence post from the gate, which was where they had always, wordlessly and without discussion, left things for each other over the years. A borrowed tool returned. A note about the creek level. Small, ordinary communications between neighbors. The next morning there was a reply folded in the same place. It said, "CH, take all the time you need. I will be here." Something in her chest moved at that. She stood at the fence line in the early morning cold and held the small piece of paper and breathed the high desert air and let herself feel it. The thing that would not go away no matter how angry she was. The persistent and inconvenient fact of what she felt for him. A week passed. Then two. She realized, waiting for herself to stop wanting to forgive him, because that would make the decision simple. But the wanting was not going away. If anything, it was growing more articulate, clarifying itself with each day the way high desert water clarifies after a storm, settling into something transparent and specific and impossible to misread. She had loved him in the letters. She had loved who he was, the real person behind the words, and now she knew that person had a name and a face and a fence line, and a horse named General and gray eyes that were the color of weather coming in from the mountains. And the person she had loved in the letters was the same person who had sat at her dinner table, who had repaired her roof without being asked, who had said, "She's right," at the town council meeting with a quiet and absolute certainty, who had sat in her barn at 2 in the morning because he had seen her light and wanted to make sure she was not alone with her worry. He had not deceived her about himself. He had deceived her about his identity. Those were different things, and the distinction mattered. On the 17th of November, 1878, Caroline Hadley walked out of her house on a cold, clear morning, opened the gate between her property and Isaiah Warren's, and walked across to his front door and knocked on it. He opened the door and looked at her. She said, "I am still angry. I know. I also need you to understand that I am doing this in spite of the anger, not because I have resolved it." Something in his expression shifted, became very careful and very still, the way a man is still when he is trying not to hope too loudly. "I understand," he said. "I fell in love with you," she said. "The letters are real. Everything I wrote is real. And everything you wrote to me, I want you to tell me now, standing in front of me with your actual name, that it was all real." "It was all real," he said, without hesitation, without flourish. Just the fact of it, stated the way he had always stated things, as something that existed and required only to be named. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Then you are going to need to earn this. The trust that you took without asking. You're going to have to earn it back." "Yes," he said. "Starting with dinner," she said. "Saturday, but this time you are cooking." Something happened to his face then that she had never seen before, something that broke through the stillness entirely, a warmth and a brightness that turned him briefly, unguardedly beautiful. "Yes," he said again. "I can do that." "Good," she said. And she turned and walked back through the gate to her own property, and she allowed herself, once her back was to him, to smile. That Saturday dinner was different from all the ones before it. Not dramatically, not with any ceremony, but in the way that everything is different when you are finally being honest about what you are. Isaiah cooked, which he did well and without apparent concern for being observed doing it. He made a beef stew with carrots and potatoes and the kind of bread that required patience, and he opened a bottle of wine that he had been keeping for something, he said, without specifying what that something had been. And Caroline sat at his kitchen table and looked at the photographs on his wall and the books on his shelf, and the shape of his life as it actually was, and felt the peculiar grace of seeing a stranger you already know. They talked about the letters. He had kept all of hers, he told her, tied with a piece of cord in the drawer of his writing desk. She had kept all of his, she told him, in a box on the shelf in her bedroom. They talked about specific letters, specific moments, things they had written that they had been uncertain about sending and had sent anyway, things they had read in the other's writing and turned over in their minds for days. "The letter about your brother," she said. "Daniel, that was the one that changed how I understood you." He was quiet for a moment. "What did it change?" "It made you real," she said. "Before that, there was a possibility in some protected part of my mind that you were a kind of ideal, a person constructed out of the best qualities of writing. After that letter, you were a person who had lost someone and was still carrying it. That is different." He looked at her across the table. "The letter about the night your father died," he said. "That was the one for me. You said you had held his hand and talked to him about a book because you didn't know what else to do and you were afraid that wasn't enough, and I think I understood everything about you from that." She had to look away for a moment. Then she looked back. "I am still angry," she said. "I want to keep saying that so you know I haven't resolved it into nothing." "I know," he said. "You should be. But I also think," she said carefully, "that you are the most honest person I have ever met in the ways that matter most, and that the thing you did wrong was done for the wrong reason but not with a wrong motive." "There's a difference," he said. "Yes, a large one." He stood up and took her plate and his plate to the dry sink, and then he turned and leaned against the counter and looked at her in the lamplight of his kitchen, and she was aware of the particular gravity of the moment, the way it had been gathering towards something for the entire evening. "Caroline," he said. She had heard him say her name many times. Across fence lines, across dinner tables, across the neutral territory of neighborly interaction. But this was different. This was him saying it with the full weight of who he was to her, the stranger and the neighbor both, present in a single word. "Yes," she said. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If you are willing, I would like to do it openly and with full knowledge and without any more deception of any kind ever." She considered him. He was standing against his kitchen counter with his arms at his sides and his expression direct and unguarded, and she thought about 8 months of letters and 2 years of Saturday dinners and a night in a barn at 2 in the morning and a voice from the back of a room saying, "She's right," and she thought, "Yes. Yes," she said. He smiled. Not the brief, polite smile she was accustomed to from him in public, but a real smile, the one she had imagined when reading his funnier letters, and it was even better in person than she had imagined. The courtship was not a quiet thing exactly, but it was a private one. Millhaven being Millhaven, news traveled at the speed of interest, and it was generally known within approximately 48 hours that Isaiah Warren and Caroline Hadley were spending time together in a way that was different from neighborly convenience. Miss Sutton said nothing, but smiled with a satisfaction so complete it was practically visible from across the street. Reverend Alcott offered some gentle commentary about the grace of finding companionship, which Caroline received with equal grace, and a private amusement she kept to herself. Gus Flannery at the post office said, cheerfully and without any apparent awareness of the irony, "Mr. Warren comes in for his mail more often lately," which was true and which Caroline found extremely funny. They were together constantly, and yet she felt no urgency to rush toward any particular destination, because everything that usually made courtship a kind of anxious performance was already settled. She knew him. He knew her. The questions that couples spend their early months trying to answer had been answered 8 months ago in a box of letters. What remained was the pleasure of the physical reality of him, which was considerable, and which she allowed herself to appreciate without guilt. He was, in the way that he moved through the world and through her days, a constant source of the specific kind of delight she had spent her life looking for and almost given up on. He was funny and serious in the same breath. He was gentle and direct in equal measure. He had read most of the books she loved and had strong opinions about them, and was wrong about at least a third of those opinions, and was willing to be argued with about it, which she found almost excessively attractive. In December he kissed her for the first time, on the porch of his house on an evening so cold their breath made small clouds in the air between them, and it was nothing like the formal performances she had experienced before, and everything like something she had read about and half believed was fictional. When she pulled back and looked at him, he was watching her with that particular quality of stillness that she now understood was not distance but the opposite, was actually a kind of intense presence, the way he was when something mattered to him. "I've been thinking about that for an embarrassingly long time," she told him. "How long?" she considered. "Probably since the barn in July," she admitted, which I did not want to admit to myself at the time. He made a sound that might have been a laugh. "May," he said, "the town council meeting. You stood up in that room and cited the statute, and I thought, there she is." She stared at him. "You knew in May. I knew in May. And you continued courting me through letters." "I continued courting you through letters," he agreed, with the particular tone of a man acknowledging an irony he has lived with for some time. She shook her head, and then she laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and is not for anyone else's benefit, just the pure physical fact of joy, and he laughed with her, and the cold evening air around them was full of it. He proposed in February of 1879, on the anniversary of the day she had sent that first letter to Box 14. He did it at the fence line, which she later told me Sutton was absurd and perfect and completely in character. He came out of his property at 7 in the morning while she was bringing water from the well, and he leaned on the fence and said her name in the way that always told her something significant was coming, and she put down the water bucket and turned to face him. He did not get down on one knee. They were standing in a field and the ground was frozen, and they were both practical people. But he took out of his coat pocket a small ring, a gold ring with a single turquoise stone the color of the New Mexico sky in winter, and he held it across the fence between them and said, "I wrote to you as a stranger. You wrote back with everything you were. I fell in love with you through paper and ink before I could have admitted it even to myself, and I have spent the better part of a year being grateful beyond my ability to express it that you were willing to let me explain. Caroline Hadley, I would like to spend the rest of my life explaining things to you and being wrong about a third of them and having you tell me exactly why. Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring and at his face, and at the land around them, this land that had been hers and now was also his, this place that had held her through grief and solitude, and the particular loneliness of being a woman with too much mind for her surroundings. She thought about the first letter she had written to a stranger, that February night when she had been brave for no reason she could name. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He put the ring on her finger across the fence, and then she opened the gate and stepped through it, and he put his arms around her, and she pressed her face into the warmth of his neck, and they stood in the frozen February morning in the middle of the New Mexico territory and held on. They married in April of 1879 in the small white church in Millhaven. Reverend Alcott presided with considerable satisfaction. Miss Sutton, who was Caroline's only attendant, wore her best dress and cried in the composed and dignified manner of someone who had been waiting for this outcome, and found it deeply pleasing. Elias, Isaiah's ranch hand, who had grown to 19, and had a new front tooth to replace the one lost in a horse-related incident the previous summer, served as a witness, and beamed throughout the proceedings with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of the young. The ceremony itself was short and direct, the way both of them preferred things. When Reverend Alcott asked if Caroline took Isaiah as her husband, she said yes with a clarity and steadiness that made it sound less like a formal response and more like a statement of established fact, which was what it was. Isaiah put a ring on her finger. She had made him one as well, a simple gold band, which she put on his finger in the moment after, because she had told him she saw no reason why the vow should only flow one direction, and he had agreed with the immediate conviction of someone for whom this was not a surprising suggestion. When they walked out of the church into the April light of Millhaven, the town was there to see them, because Millhaven was small and April weddings were a significant event, And there was the ordinary community warmth of people who know each other's lives expressing collective goodwill. And Caroline stood in the sunlight with Isaiah's hand in hers, and felt something so large and simple that she almost could not contain it. They went home together, to what was now their home, and the life they had been building through paper and ink and fence lines, and Saturday dinners settled itself into its real shape. The spring was full and busy with the work of combining two properties into something coherent. They made decisions together, practically and sometimes with great vigor of debate, about which animals to keep where, about how to manage the water rights they had both individually fought to protect, about which of them would take responsibility for which elements of the combined operation. Caroline kept her garden and expanded it. Isaiah kept his cattle and expanded them, slowly and methodically, in the way he did everything. They hired a second ranch hand to replace the time they were both spending on the homestead work, a quiet man named Chester who was 40 and capable, and asked no unnecessary questions. In June of 1879, Caroline Warren, who had retained the habit of an early morning walk before the heat arrived, stopped at the fence post where she and Isaiah had once left notes for each other, and stood there for a moment with her hand on the weathered cedar wood. She thought about the woman she had been in February of 1878, carrying a letter to the post office with her chin up and her expression daring anyone to say something. She thought about Box 14 and IW, and the first reply that had made her laugh aloud in her empty kitchen. Isaiah came up behind her and stood beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee in the particular way he did everything, with a kind of unhurried purpose, and handed her one. Thinking about the letters, he said. She took the coffee. Yes, I have them all, he said, every single one. So do I. They stood at the fence line in the early morning light, the two properties stretching away from them in both directions, the land that had always held them both, and drank their coffee in the specific companionable silence of people who do not need to fill everything with words. I want to tell you something, Isaiah said. She looked at him. He was watching the horizon with the expression she now knew was him gathering something he intended to say precisely. When I put that notice in the Gazette, he said, I had just finished Middlemark, which was the truth. But the reason I had just finished Middlemark was because I was trying to find out whether I could do something about the loneliness I had been living with for 6 years on that land, and I had read somewhere that the character Dorothea wrote letters when she felt isolated. It was a desperate and somewhat ridiculous experiment. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You put a notice in the paper because a Victorian novel told you to. I put a notice in the paper because a Victorian novel told me to, he confirmed. And you answered it because you were braver than me. She considered this. I answered it because I was also lonely, she said, and because Walter Prout's formatting made it look less alarming than it might have otherwise. He laughed. She loved that she could make him laugh, this quiet, certain man. She loved that she could reach that thing in him and bring it to the surface. I want you to know, he said, his tone shifting into the quiet, serious register that she had learned to listen to very carefully, that I understand what I risked by not telling you sooner. I understand that you trusted a stranger with the most interior parts of yourself, and I held that trust as something sacred. I need you to know that I never held it lightly or used it for any purpose except to know you and love you. But I also know that is not the same as being fully honest, and I will be sorry for that for a long time. She looked at him. I know, she said. And she did. She had resolved it, or mostly resolved it, in the months since that conversation at the post office. What remained was not anger but a kind of earned knowledge, the understanding that love is not the absence of imperfection, but the willingness to be present with it, on both sides. I forgive you, she said. I think I forgave you in March and was too stubborn to admit it for 6 more weeks. He looked at her. March, he said. The first fence post note. I wrote I am not finished being angry, and I already was. He shook his head slowly, and the expression on his face was one she had been putting in a private collection for months, the one she thought of as his everything, because it was every complicated thing he felt about her made visible at once. He kissed her at the fence line in the June morning, with coffee cups in both their hands, and the land spread golden and wide around them in every direction. By the autumn of 1879, Caroline was expecting their first child. She told Isaiah on an October evening in the kitchen, sitting across from him at the table she had moved from her old house into this one, the same table at which she had written every single letter to her stranger. He went very still for a moment in the particular way that meant something had arrived that was large enough to require stillness to receive it. Then he looked at her with an expression that she had no previous category for, and which she spent some time afterward trying to describe in the journal she had taken to keeping. She wrote, "He looked at me the way a man looks when he understands that the ground of his life has shifted permanently in the direction he wanted it to shift but was too cautious to hope for. There is a kind of joy that is almost indistinguishable from grief in its intensity, in the way it asks everything of you. That is what I saw in his face, and I think my own face showed him the same thing reflected." He came around the table and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands and held them and said her name once, just Caroline, the same way he had said it in the post office all those months ago, and this time it meant something entirely different. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am very all right," she said. "I am frightened and I am very all right." "Both of those make sense," he said, which was the perfect thing to say, as he so often managed to find the perfect thing without appearing to search for it. They settled into the expectant autumn together, quietly and with a growing awareness of the future taking shape. Isaiah built a cradle, spending 3 weeks on it with a focused patience that Elias observed with something approaching reverence, and Chester observed with the expression of a man who has seen things change and considers most changes to be reasonable. Caroline assembled the small garments and blankets and necessary items with a practicality and a tenderness running side by side in everything she did. She wrote to her journal every evening. She wrote about the land and the season, and what it felt like to be carrying a life you had chosen, in all the different senses of the word chosen. She also, in a moment of pure sentiment that she would never have predicted of herself 2 years earlier, wrote one more letter to Box 14. She wrote it in November of 1879, addressed it to I.W., and walked it to the Millhaven post office. Gus Flannery looked at the address and then looked at her with an expression of profound confusion. She smiled at him. "He'll understand," she said. That evening, Isaiah came in from checking the cattle in the last light, came into the kitchen where she was at the stove, and set a piece of paper on the table beside her. She looked at it. It was addressed to CH in his handwriting. She turned to look at him, and he had the look of a man who is simultaneously embarrassed and not at all sorry. She opened it. It said, "CH, I do not know who keeps mailing letters to Box 14, but they keep finding their way to me. I am beginning to think the post office knows something. I want to tell you that this year, which has contained more joy and more difficulty and more genuine living than the previous 6 years combined, has been the best year of my life, and I expect the year following to exceed it in all the same ways, because that is the nature of expansion, which is what you have brought to everything. Yours, completely, I.W." She folded the letter and held it to her chest, and stood at the stove in her kitchen in the November dark, while the supper bubbled quietly and her husband watched her from across the room with all of himself present in his face. And she thought about a February night in 1878, when a woman named Caroline Hadley had sealed a letter to a stranger and walked it to the post office with her chin up. She thought, "Of all the brave and reckless things I have done, that was the best one." Their son was born in the last week of May 1880, in the bedroom that had been Isaiah's and was now theirs, with Dorothy Alcott and Miss Sutton in attendance. And the midwife, a Tejana woman named Senora Vega, who had been delivering babies in Calhoun County for 20 years, and who ran the proceedings with a calm authority that Caroline found deeply reassuring. The labor was long but not dangerous, And when it was finished and Senora Vega placed in Caroline's arms a small and entirely perfect person who was making his opinion of the world known at considerable volume, Caroline looked up at Isaiah, who was standing beside the bed with his hand in hers, and an expression so complete in its overwhelmed joy that it was almost painful to look at directly. "Hello," she said to the small person. "We have been waiting for you." They named him Edmund Daniel Warren, Edmund for her father, Daniel for his brother. The two men they had loved and lost, carried forward in this new small life, who looked at the world with gray eyes that were very like his father's and an imperious expression that Isaiah said, with great affection, was very like his mother's. The summer of 1880 was the summer of Edmund, who turned out to be a person of definite and vigorous opinions from the very beginning, requiring a great deal of attention and providing a great deal of delight, and who had the specific quality of beauty that new parents see in their children regardless of circumstance, but which in this case was also genuinely apparent to the other people in Millhaven who encountered him. Miss Sutton said he was the finest-looking infant she had seen in 20 years of infant observation. Senora Vega said he had a good strong voice and would not be ignored, which was going to be either wonderful or extremely challenging depending on the situation. Elias held him once with the terrified concentration of someone handling an object of great fragility and value, and then looked up at Isaiah and said, "I don't know how he's so small," which Isaiah agreed was one of the more astonishing aspects of the situation. Caroline recovered well and fully, and by August she was back in her garden with Edmund in a basket in the shade of the porch, working with the focused satisfaction of someone in possession of everything they need. She had everything she needed. She was aware of this fact with a constant low gratitude that she tried not to take for granted, remembering the earlier self who had sat alone in this kitchen and written to a stranger. Isaiah came to the garden gate and leaned on it the way he leaned on fence lines, with that relaxed, purposeful ease, and watched her for a moment. "What?" she said without looking up. "Nothing," he said, "just looking." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was watching her with the expression she had been collecting for over a year now, and which she thought she would never entirely get used to, the one that was everything about how he loved her made casually visible. "Get in here and help with the beans," she told him. He came in. They worked together in the August heat, the kind of work that is ordinary and physical and completely satisfying, with the baby in his basket making small exploratory sounds and General the horse visible over the fence, watching them with the expression of a horse who has seen everything and is beyond surprise. "I want to tell you something," Isaiah said. She looked at him. He was looking at the bean plants with the focused attention he gave everything, his hands working steadily. "Go ahead," she said. "I have been thinking," he said, "about that notice in the Gazette, about what would have happened if you hadn't answered it." She thought about this. "You would have gotten a reply from someone else," she said, "and you would have written polite letters for 3 months and then found them not interesting enough." "Possibly," he said. "Or I would have gotten no replies at all and continued reading Victorian novels alone, which also seems possible." "It seems extremely possible, actually," she said. He smiled. "What I was thinking," he said, "was that every particular thing that brought you to that letter on that day, your father's books, your decision to stay on this land, Thomas Birch being a man with insufficient capacity for you, every single thing that made you the person who would read that notice and think, 'Yes, I will write to this stranger,' and then actually do it instead of talking yourself out of it. All of those things are the reason I am standing in a bean garden with my wife and my son." She sat back and looked at him properly. "That is a large thought," she said. "I have been sitting with it for a while," he admitted. "What do you do with it?" she asked. He looked at her. "I try to be worthy of it," he said simply. She stood up and walked the few steps between them and put her hand against his face in the same direct, unhurried way she had approached everything in the years she had lived on this land, and he turned into it, and they stood in the bean garden in the August afternoon, while their son made further investigations of the world from his basket and General watched from the fence. "You already are," she said. He covered her hand with his. In September, they received a letter from Isaiah's mother in Texas, the first one in over a year, and it said that she was not well and asked if they might come. They made arrangements, asked Chester to manage the property, loaded Edmund and their necessary belongings into the wagon, and made the 4-day journey to San Antonio. Isaiah's mother, a woman named Ruth Warren, was 60 years old and had lived through things that had made her quiet and careful, and she received them in her small house with a reserve that Caroline recognized as the same protective stillness Isaiah had had before the letters had opened it. She was thin and unwell, but not in immediate danger, her doctor confirmed, more exhausted than critically ill, requiring rest and care and the kind of company that required nothing of her. Caroline cooked. She organized. She quietly took over the management of the household with a competence and a warmth that was simply who she was, not performed, not strategic. She did not try to make Ruth Warren love her. She simply occupied the same space as her with the fullness of her own presence and let whatever would happen happen. On the 3rd day, Ruth Warren asked to hold Edmund. She held him for a long time in her chair by the window, the small boy looking up at her with the large, curious gray eyes that were so clearly his father's. And Caroline watched from across the room as something shifted in the older woman's face, some long-held tension releasing, and she thought, "There it is." By the end of the week, Ruth Warren was calling her Caroline rather than Mrs. Warren, which was the kind of small seismic shift that means everything. She asked about the homestead, the letters coming out of her in fits and starts as she recovered her strength, and Caroline answered honestly and in detail, and Ruth listened with genuine attention and said, more than once, that it sounded like good land. On the last evening before they left, Ruth took Caroline's hands and said, "He wrote to me about you before he had the courage to tell you who he was. He wrote about the letters. He said he had never known anyone who wrote the way you did, who made him feel understood on paper in a way that he had not thought possible. I thought then that whoever you were the right one." Caroline held Ruth Warren's hands and felt the weight of that, the woman who had raised Isaiah looking at her and giving her this thing, this piece of him that went all the way back. "I love him very much," Caroline said. "I know you do," Ruth said. "I can see it in how you talk to him. As though he is exactly who he is and you are glad of it. That is rare." They left the next morning. Isaiah drove the wagon and Caroline sat beside him with Edmund in her lap and the Texas landscape moving past them in its flat and enormous way. And after a while, Isaiah reached over and took her hand on top of the sleeping baby and held it, and they drove in silence for a long time. "Thank you," he said eventually. "Your mother is a remarkable woman," Caroline said. "She liked you," he said. "She doesn't like people. She endures them or she ignores them. She liked you." "I liked her too," Caroline said. He squeezed her hand. She watched the road ahead and felt the steady rocking of the wagon and the warmth of her son against her chest, and the warmth of her husband's hand in hers, and the road stretching out in front of them toward the property that held their life. And she thought, this is what brave and reckless things are for. They are for arriving here. They got home in October, in the full amber glory of the New Mexico autumn, and found the property in excellent order thanks to Chester, who had managed everything with his characteristic quiet competence, and accepted their thanks with a nod that suggested gratitude was pleasant but unnecessary. The second year of their marriage settled into its own particular rhythm, different from the first in the way that things deepen when you have been through difficulty together, and come back into the ordinary, with a fuller knowledge of what the ordinary holds. There were arguments, genuine ones, about decisions regarding the cattle and the water rights and the management of the combined property, and the arguments were conducted with all the directness and stubbornness that both of them possessed in quantity, and they were generally resolved by someone, eventually saying a thing so precisely correct that the other person had to acknowledge it. and occasionally the correct thing was said by Caroline, and occasionally it was said by Isaiah, and sometimes they arrived at it together in the middle of the argument and started laughing, which was by far the best outcome. Edmund grew. He was, by his first birthday, pulling himself along furniture at remarkable speed and expressing opinions about his food with great vigor. He had Isaiah's eyes and Caroline's stubbornness, which Isaiah said was going to be either spectacular or catastrophic, and Caroline said was going to be spectacular and let's discuss that further, and Isaiah said she had just proved his point, and they both laughed. Miss Sutton threw Edmund a first birthday celebration at the dry goods store with all of Millhaven's children invited, and a cake that she had made herself, and which was, objectively, the best cake that anyone in the territory had eaten in living memory. Edmund ate a significant portion of his share directly off the table and showed no remorse, which earned him the immediate approval of every child present and the fond amusement of everyone else. In the spring of 1882, Caroline discovered she was expecting again. She told Isaiah the same way she had the first time, at the kitchen table in the evening, and watched the same quality of stillness take him, the same deep receiving of something large. But this time it was also accompanied by a kind of ease that had not been there the first time, the ease of the second chapter, when you know the story is going somewhere good. Edmund is going to have an opinion about this, Isaiah said. Edmund has an opinion about everything, Caroline pointed out. He had an opinion about the color of his bowl this morning. He's two, Isaiah said. He's establishing his philosophical position. She laughed. She loved the way he talked about their son, with that particular mixture of gravity and amusement that was so entirely him. Their second child, a daughter, was born in October of 1882 in the same bedroom, with Senora Vega again presiding. They named her Ruth Edith Warren, the first name for Isaiah's mother, who was still alive in Texas, and had been writing more frequently since the visit, the second for Dorothy Alcott, who had been a quiet and consistent source of warmth in Caroline's life, and who had cried when she heard the news with the same composed dignity she brought to all things. Ruth was, from her first hours, a different creature from her brother, quieter and more observant, lying in her cradle with wide dark eyes taking in the world as though she was cataloging information that she would address in due course. She had Caroline's coloring, dark hair and a quality of focused attention, and Isaiah's patience, which was a combination that Senora Vega said would make her either a very great scholar or a very great trouble, and possibly both. Edmund's opinion of his sister evolved over the first week from suspicious curiosity to a proprietary affection that manifested as standing guard over her cradle and explaining things to her in a low, serious voice, which was so entirely his father in miniature that Caroline had to leave the room on more than one occasion to deal with the feeling it produced. The autumn of 1882 was full and good. The cattle herd had grown to a size that was beginning to require serious management decisions. Chester had, over the past year, taken on a supervisory role that suited him completely, and which Isaiah had formalized with a pay increase that Chester had accepted with his characteristic wordless nod. The garden had been expanded to include a small orchard, 4 apple trees and 2 pear trees, young enough that the real harvest was still years away, but present enough to feel like a promise. Miss Sutton came to dinner in November and sat at the table that had once been in Caroline's kitchen and ate Senora Vega's recipe for postle that Caroline had learned and improved upon, and held Ruth on her lap, while Edmund told her at considerable length about a horse he had seen that morning and its various qualities. Me ate and listened and looked around the kitchen with its shelves of books and its warmth and its organized abundance and said, "You know, when you first moved here and I saw the books before I saw you, I thought, either this is going to be very interesting or she is going to be very unhappy." And, Caroline said, "Very interesting," me said contentedly. "Considerably more interesting than I anticipated, to tell the truth." Isaiah, who was standing at the stove, turned to look at Caroline across the kitchen, and in the lamplight his expression was the one she had been collecting for years, the one that was everything about him visible at once. She held it for a moment, the way you hold something of great value, aware of what you have. In December of 1882, a package arrived from Ruth Warren in Texas. It contained a quilt, hand-pieced in the Texas pattern of stars and diamonds, and a letter that said, "This was begun when Isaiah first wrote to tell me about the woman in New Mexico who wrote to strangers about books. I have been completing it over the past 2 years. It is for your family. It is made with considerable affection." Caroline unfolded the quilt in the kitchen and held it up to the light. It was large enough to cover their bed. It was the kind of thing that takes years and thousands of small, deliberate stitches, and a love that expresses itself through fabric because words are not quite adequate. She sat down at the writing desk, the same desk her father had owned that still bore the mark of the cottonwood branch from the August storm of 1878, and she wrote a letter to Ruth Warren that was 3 pages long and said, among many other things, "I want you to know that the man you raised is the finest person I know. I want you to know that every letter he ever wrote to me was true, every single word, and that this is the rarest and most precious thing I have encountered in my life. I want you to know that your family and mine are one thing now, held together by your son's goodness and your quilt and this land we are all of us tending, and I am grateful for it every day." She sealed the letter and walked it to the post office in the December cold, which was crisp and clear and smelled of cedar and distant rain, and Gus Flannery took the letter and looked at the address and said, with the comfortable familiarity of a postmaster who has witnessed a great deal, "Beautiful day, Mrs. Warren." "Yes, it is," she said. She walked home through the December afternoon, past the church and the dry goods store where Mee was visible through the window talking to someone with great animation, past the livery where the horses stood in their patient winter patience, past the Gazette office where Walter Prout was most likely writing something with strong opinions about taxation, past all of it, out to the edge of town where the road opened up and the territory began to reassert itself in its scale and its silence and its vast, indifferent beauty. She walked home to the property that held her life, the fence lines and the garden and the orchard with its young trees making their slow promise of future fruit. She walked up the porch steps and through the door into the warmth and the sound of her house, Edmund's voice asking something in the kitchen and Isaiah's voice answering, and Ruth's small sounds from somewhere above. She stood in the hallway and felt it all settle around her, the weight and the warmth of it, this life she had built from a single brave and reckless letter. Isaiah appeared in the kitchen doorway with Edmund on his hip, a position that Edmund was technically too old for but still requested regularly, and Isaiah looked at her and said, "You walked, it's cold." "I wanted to walk," she said. "We saved Postle," he said. "Good," she said. She came into the kitchen and sat down at the table, and Edmund climbed down from his father's hip and came to show her a drawing he had made, a horse and several people of varying accuracy, and Isaiah put the Postle on the stove to reheat and came to stand behind her chair and looked at the drawing over her shoulder. "That one's you," Edmund said, pointing to a figure with dark marks that presumably represented hair. "And that's Papa, and that's me, and that's Ruth." "It's excellent," Caroline said seriously. "I know," Edmund said, with the serene confidence of a person who has not yet encountered the concept of false modesty. Isaiah laughed, quiet and warm behind her, and put his hand on her shoulder, and she covered it with her own. Outside the windows, the December evening was coming in dark and cold, and studded with the particular stars of the New Mexico territory, the ones that her father had taught her to name, the one she had written to a stranger about on a cold night 3 years ago, saying, "The sky here is enormous and I am very small beneath it, and this is both frightening and the greatest comfort I know." She had written that to I.W. in November of 1878, and he had written back, "I know exactly what you mean. The small feeling is the right feeling. It means you are paying attention." She sat in her kitchen with her family around her and the stars outside and the warmth within, and she thought of that, the woman she had been on the other side of all of this, small beneath an enormous sky with a pen in her hand, and a hope she barely dared to name. She had written to a stranger. The stranger had answered, and she had found in the answering that the person who knew her best had been there all along, on the other side of a fence line, waiting for the moment when they would both be brave enough to say it. The quilt from Texas was spread across the bed upstairs, stars and diamonds in the lamplight, stitched together over years with the particular love that expresses itself through patient, persistent work. The letters were in a box on the shelf. Box 14 was still at the Millhaven post office, and Gus Flannery still checked it every day out of habit, and it still sometimes received letters that were not going anywhere. Just two people writing to each other because the habit of writing to each other had become the habit of knowing each other, which was, in the end, the thing. Caroline looked at Edmund's drawing, at the four figures rendered in pencil, and thought, here is the account. This is what the brave and reckless letter produced. This husband and these children and this kitchen and this land and this life that contains enough truth in it to last another 40 years, God willing, and she intended to be willing. More possible, Zaya said. Yes, she said, please. He put the bowl in front of her and she picked up her spoon, and the evening went on in its warm and ordinary way, exactly as it should.